Good evening, everybody, and happy Halloween. Welcome to week 5 of our journey into the Spanda Karikas. We have a really exciting class ahead, so I'm going to pass things over to Chris, who's going to take us on a great journey this Halloween evening.
Swagatam, welcome to everybody far and wide, near and close, all around the world tonight for week 5. And what a night this is. This is a very sacred class for me personally, particularly because of the verse that I hope to conclude on tonight, which is one of the most beautiful teachings that I've ever come across. And for the first time, through the eyes and heart and wisdom and enlightened reality of Sri Kshemaraja. So let's begin with an invocation. Taking a comfortable but steady, straight position. If we're in a chair, the best way to sit for any even brief mantra or meditation is to anchor our sitting bones into the crux of the chair at the 90-degree angle, and to inhale with the chest and chin high and settle down with the vertebrae gently stacking on top of each other so that we're not leaning back into the chair with the top of our back. Others are on the floor, so we're just going to make sure that the sitting bones are well supported. And so, as always, we'll begin with 3 recitations of the pranava, the primal syllable Om, which represents in the Tantric tradition the embodiment of the living goddess Spanda Shakti. That is to say, it is the source vibration before creation is unveiled out of its own essence, and the created universe is withdrawn into Spanda. This sound is Om. And so we can think of this as the pulsation of the breath. In terms of our inhale, the creative power, the dissolving power of out-breath, the breath of the universe. And so when we chant this syllable, we literally bring into our awareness a state of presence, and this is affected, or let us say supported, by taking the posture called the divine posture, the Divya Karana, which we discussed a bit last week, aka the Bhairavi Mudra. And this is done by taking a breath in for about 5 seconds into the heart, perhaps rolling forward just a bit with the chin, slowly opening with a pause for 3 seconds, and releasing the jaw with a gentle sigh. So 3 recitations of the primal syllable representing the ocean of Spanda Shakti, of Shiva consciousness. And then we invoke the mother, the goddess herself, as the heart through the mantra Shreem. 3 rounds, and this is the wave on the ocean of consciousness, the wave of this particular body, the sound wave of pure, enlightened awareness of Spanda Shakti that I attune with in the heart space, that pivotal point of origin out of which all creation flows forth and all things dissolve. 3 rounds, remembering that at basically the last third or so, or perhaps quarter of the out-breath for each mantra should be focused on resonating the sound of the bindu, which we've been doing every week. And this is the sound of the palatal highest vowel in Sanskrit. If you like the sound of the bees buzzing, the sound hum. So following this, we'll hear the Saraswati mantra to bless us with an open heart and the ability to receive the transmission from the ancient master Kshemaraja and Kalata, who wrote the Spanda Karikas, this revolutionary, life-affirming, transcendentally empowering teaching from 1,000 years ago. Let us begin drawing in the in-breath to the heart space for our bija mantras. we're calling in she who is the personification of splendor, the rapture of self-awakening, of self-realization, the goddess Shri. Taking the breath in slowly. Shri. Ya kundendu tushara hara davala, ya shubra vastra vrita, ya vina varadanda mandita karaha, ya shweta padmasana, ya brahma chuta shankara prabhitibir divyai sada vandita, samam patu saraswati bhagavati, Vishesha Jadhyapaham. We praise the Supreme Goddess Saraswati, she who flows with grace, or is the flow of grace, whose face is as beautiful as a jasmine flower, who is as luminescent as the moon, as intricate as a snowflake, who is dressed in glorious white garments. She holds the veena in her hands and bestows boons on her disciples as she sits on her white lotus throne in the heart. We honor beloved Saraswati, who is encircled and worshipped by the gods, that she may bestow blessings upon us. May the goddess remove our ignorance and brighten our life with the light of knowledge. So welcome to week 5. And this week we will see the culmination of the first part of the Spanda Karikas, which is entitled on the table of contents, Vibration as One's Own Essential Being, Spanda as One's True Nature, Swarupa Spanda. So this covers the first, it's arguable, really the first 22 verses. On your table of contents I stretched it to 25, because Kshemaraja sort of artificially does this. I mean, the text itself doesn't even really have parts. This is his partition, and we're following that out of honor to him. So, the end of tonight we'll reach verse 22, which is, as I indicated earlier, really my favorite verse, the most awesome verse of this text that really just hit me so deeply some 18 years ago, when I first discovered this wonderful teaching. And from there, we will move next week into the second part, how to spontaneously experience one's own highest wisdom. These are Kshemaraja's titles. Sahaja Vidyodaya, literally the ascension or the rise of that wisdom of divine consciousness that happens sahaja, spontaneously. And there we will move directly into the core practical teachings of daily tantric yoga and learn how the liberating power of mantras creates an attunement with the highest Spanda Shakti. But for now, we're finishing up this sort of intro section, Vibration is One's Own Essential Being, in which, as we've seen, the text and Kshemaraja's commentary seek to bring us into a state of awareness that we're much more than our mind tells us we are. And to identify with the source Spanda, and this is something I've been wanting to review or sort of go over again, because I've mentioned it a few times, but it's perhaps worth one more round. When we talk about the word Spanda, which means pulsation or vibration, pulsation slightly better as a definition, we're really talking about two things. We're talking about Spanda as the source essence, Spanda Tattva, meaning to say the coiled power of pure Shakti, who is a mass of bliss consciousness, as we've heard described, and the effect of the movement of Shakti in this way. Spanda pulsation, of course, connotes the two major movements of birth and death, of expansion and contraction. So when we attune with the spanda, what do we mean? What does that phrase mean? Well, on the first level, it means first coming to awareness that all dynamism is a part of Shakti. So this is just a mundane realization that the contractions and expansions of my breath, of my thoughts, of nature, of all of reality, the contraction, the balance of contraction and expansion in music, etc., all of reality is governed by the spanda principle. And that's the key phrase, governed by the spanda principle. For ultimately, the word spanda refers to that still, and I'm going to give you a slight, contradiction here, but it's described as that still quivering throb of pure consciousness, the heart of all beings, the enlightened state. So the goal is to attune with that essence, which is known to us in these divine moments where our breath suddenly comes to a pause, where the mind experiences a gap between thoughts. And the yogi is one who attunes, who is ready for these moments to arise in everyday waking life. So we'll find that this teaching culminates with just, a rapture of the teaching in Karika 22. So again, reminding you that if you have reflections or questions you'd like shared tonight, please just write them in, and we will handle them at a certain point, probably towards the end. And at that point, you can call in as well. So our handout, week 5 verses, hopefully you have that out before you. And we left off last week with a sort of a section of 2 verses that's more or less a mandatory section in these texts in which the commentator is sort of required to refute his opponents, his philosophical opponents. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these 2 verses, nor am I going to read every bit of translation I've posted in the handout, because some of it's a bit redundant, but I just want to be thorough. So Kshemaraja will bother in verses 12 and 13, or his commentary of those verses, to refute a major competitor of Tantric Shaivism around his day, the 11th century, and that is the Middle Path school of Buddhism. And a school that perhaps some of you know a little better, which is namely Advaita Vedanta, the school of the great sage Shankaracharya, his non-dual system of philosophy. So just a little bit on that. And I think I introduced these 2 schools last week. But Madhyamaka Buddhism, or Middle Path Buddhism, the middle way path of Buddhism, is founded pre-Tantra, sometime around the first 2 centuries A.D., by Nagarjuna. This is the earliest school of the great vehicle of Buddhism, or the second major movement of Buddhism. And it posits that ultimate reality is shunya, that it is a void, emptiness, in which there's neither a knowing subject, the act of knowing, or anything known. And so there's no active perception, let us say. This is stated perhaps by Nagarjuna because he doesn't want the ego to get caught up in the world of form, the world of name, of post-it notes, if you will, so that we can be free of mental conceptuality and attune with Buddha consciousness. But this notion that everything's just void or empty is problematic for Kshemaraja. Advaita Vedanta, founded by Shankaracharya, a little bit later, a few centuries later, actually in the heyday of Tantra. He lived 7th century, early heyday. And he posits that there is a reality, unlike the Buddhist point of view. It's a solid reality. It's all that there is, and that's Brahman, the absolute. Sort of like the Force in Star Wars, but without the Force. That is to say, a non-deified ultimate reality, but without the Force, because Shankara denies that there's change, that dynamism, that the experience of movement is real. So in other words, objective reality for Advaita Vedanta is an illusion. So we'll see just briefly tonight how Kshemaraja takes that on, and then get back into the sort of deeper spanda immersion of the text. So verses 12 and 13. Na bhavo bhavyatam edi, na chataras tatras dihamugata, yatto biyogasam sparshat, tadasititi nishchaya, atas tat kritimam yeyam sao shubda bhadabhatsada napwevam smaryam anantvam tat tatvam pratipadyate. This is verses 12 and 13. Non-existence cannot be an object of contemplation, nor can awareness ever be absent in any act of contemplation. For when one endeavors to remember or to recall any past experience, one has no doubt that, hey, that occurred. I remember the event. As a result, the notion that there can be an absence of awareness ever is discerned to be artificial. For it is similar to dreamless deep sleep, which has no objective focus. But that spanda essence is constantly perceived in all states of awareness, regardless of where one places their focus, and thus is not really something that is best discerned through the experience of memory. So this is about as heady as the text gets, fortunately. Shamaraj will unpack it in a way that hopefully will make sense to us. So he does so by refuting the schools that posit that perception is an illusion. Now, the Buddhist point of view, as we already saw, denies that perception can be real because it denies that there's a perceiver. Whereas the Vedanta position does acknowledge a perceiver, but furthermore, or beyond that, states that, yeah, there's a perceiver, but everything you see is fake, is an illusion, because dynamism isn't real. And of course, dynamism is all we really see. So, what does he say? This is his refutation of Advaita Vedanta. Somewhat comical, we'll find at times. He doesn't want to spend a lot of time wrestling with his opponents, so he sort of sweeps them under the rug with a couple of bold strokes of his pen. So he says, quote, non-existence, unquote, as contemplated by the follower of Vedanta through the statement, the highest truth is that this reality has never existed, unquote, does not consider or fails to consider the act of contemplation. For if you're going to contemplate anything, this infers that there is an objective target for the contemplation. Whereas the phrase non-existence used by the Vedantins simply indicates nothing. This is supposed to be somewhat funny, I think. Basically saying, what a ridiculous thing to say, that this reality that we experience of change doesn't exist. Because he argues here, well then how do you account for the fact that I see it? Because then I'm an illusion, right? So to say non-existence means nothing to me. It indicates nothing because I experience existence, I experience change. How does this help us? So he goes on, furthermore, how can a denial of the existing universe be imagined when the one contemplating it would then himself vanish into the absolute? If the contemplative experience of a contemplator or a perceiver is accepted as real, then the statement dissolution of the universe becomes an illogical concept. For the perceiver himself remains to perceive it. Hence, the Vedantins claim that the supreme is only experienced in the dissolution of the objective universe is ridiculous, he says. Okay, very simply put, he's saying, if I am here and perceiving this world, it's real. Now, maybe my perception of it is skewered by my ego, by false understanding, but I see something. I see dynamism. I see birth and death all over the place. So he's basically denying the Advaita Vedanta position, which ultimately stands on the basis that while you are in a body and experiencing the illusion of change, you cannot know Brahman. You cannot know the Absolute. You're not liberated. Well, this tradition, the Spanda tradition of Tantra, says, or gives us for the first time the idea or the reality that one can be liberated while living, meaning to say by mastering one's awareness and attunement with the source of change itself. So he completely denies the reality of this is all empty of change, when that's what we experience. When I first read this 18 years ago, it really hit me because I had the same question. And perhaps some of you have as well if you studied Advaita Vedanta. So there's a lot more to say about that, but he moves on just to keep this critique short. And now he replies to the Buddhist point of view that all objects of contemplation are not real at all, including the perceiver. So he says, it is taught in Spandakarika verse 13 that in order to contemplate the void, there can be no real act of perception, for awareness would then be absent, and thus this contemplation is impossible. So in other words, it's impossible to think about emptiness because emptiness is emptiness, quite simply. So here he's being a little kindergarten with us. And quotes this text called the Aloka Mala, which we've lost. And that text says, this is not a Buddhist text. It's probably some Hindu or Shaiva Tantra text. We're not sure. It says, the state known as emptiness, called the void, refers to something that cannot be conceived by people. This is not the same as a popular belief in the existence of a reality called the void, rendered by the Buddhists. So, the critique is, if emptiness is emptiness, we can't even characterize it as anything. You can't describe it. Then why bother trying to meditate on it? Now, we can be aware of moments where our mind or our state of reality seems empty of thoughts or of concepts. But to actually try to imagine what the void is without an experienced teacher, well, you're just going to screw yourself up. And, of course, the whole idea here is Kshemaraja and his contemporaries are all about a life-affirming attitude towards accepting this reality as divine. And he's basically refuting these Buddhists and the Vedantins because they inherently are stating that what we see is not real. That's the bottom line here. So he says, if people are unable to cognize that state of the void, then one should follow a true spiritual teacher who's proficient in the realization of that state and should not rely on one's own judgment in deciphering a term like the void, the consequence of which is to throw oneself and others into the unimaginable chasm of great delusion. I love it because he uses a word that can mean chasm here, or void itself. So he's saying the void the Buddhists are talking about is the void of confusion. So enough of this. And he finally finishes by saying, in terms of this critique, when the defects of the Buddhists have been exposed, then the defects of the Vedantins are exposed, for their reasoning is similar. So let's say nothing more about this. As for whether or not we can remember our peak experiences where the Spanda essence is all that there is, he says, the principle of Spanda cannot be remembered as can an experience of emptiness. Meaning to say, I can remember, at least vaguely, that I was sort of bereft of thought for that period of that meditation. But it cannot, the actual power, the surge of consciousness cannot be remembered. Why? Because it's always a present moment experience. And so he says, it can never be declared as absent, for it is constantly experienced, meaning that it is the experiencer behind all experiences, as correctly taught in the ancient Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which is a Vedic text. Quote, by what means can one know the knower? Okay, so all of this is to say, quite logically and well rendered, actually, if we read through this a couple of times, and for some of us, that's what it'll take, because it's new for us. What is the point of trying to remember your greatest highs? That is to say, you can't recreate them in memory, because Spanda can only be experienced in the present moment. Why? Because it is never absent. It is constantly experienced. But on what level am I experiencing it? On the level of the mundane level of the chaos of my monkey mind? Or have I learned as a yogi to attune with the source itself, which is flowering forth always underneath the noise of my mind and the chatter of my senses? So he closes this thought by sort of summarizing what it is to know the Spanda principle. Spanda tattvam apitu sarvan yusyatan avachana prakashananda sara parapram mritur rupamivatat tasma shabda arta chintasu na savastana yashava iti. For the Spanda principle is the supreme experiencer within us. It is the quintessence of the universe. It is the perceptual flow of bliss that emanates from the source light of awareness, which is forever present in all experiences. As the author of our text, Kalata, will proclaim in a later stanza, there is no object, word, or thought, nor any state which is not Shiva. And so Kshemaraj adds to that this beautiful contemplation or affirmation. Atosyan avachina chamatkara rupasyana jatu chit smaryam anantwam mudatwam va. Hence, the Spanda principle, which manifests as the uninterrupted delight of surging consciousness, can never be an object of memory, nor can it be experienced through, quote, an absence of awareness. Little extra dig to the Buddhists. Now, we can go off on 10 tangents about this. I mean, of course, he's being a little harsh, particularly on the Buddhists, because there are Buddhist schools that are not quite saying this, but the general sort of orthodox of the middle path school of Buddhism is probably, asserting that awareness is not real, as we see in some of their texts. So he's countering this. He's saying it absolutely is real, and it's Shiva on all levels of our awareness, even the ones that are not that pleasant. Behind thoughts, words, emotions, behind all of this is that pulsating surge of pure bliss consciousness, that source light. Okay, so the Spanda principle then is going to be defined very clearly here as experienced in two states. And in so doing, the text will run through these next three verses with the major theme of the universal perceiver who is experienced as oneself. Before we can attune with the source Spanda principle, which surges through us in moments when we least expect it, in the greatest experiences, as we'll see at the end of the class tonight, these are all passive experiences of that supreme Spanda nectar. But now we're gradually being taught how to unlearn, and I want to accent un here, unlearn the belief system that we are not that universal perceiver. And the text will do this by first simplifying our own perceptive reality. Verses 14 through 16. Now we're on, by the way, I have a different document, so I'm not sure what page we're on. Page 3, okay. Avasta yugalam chatra charya karturtva shabditam karyata akshayani tatra karturtvam punar akshayam. Here, meaning in our teaching, the Spanda principle comprises two states called subjectivity and objectivity. Objects perish, while the experience of subjectivity never perishes. Karyonmukha prayatno ya kevalam sotra lupyate tasmin luptosmiti abuddha pratipadyate natu yontar nuko bhava sarvihantva guna spadam tasya lopa kada chitsyad anasyan nupalam bhanat. For when one directs their attention to the Spanda principle within, the only thing which actually dissolves is the act of engaging the objective world. When that engagement ceases, the fool believes, I have ceased to be. But this inner reality, Shiva's nature, is the abode for the attribute or the experience of omniscience. It can never cease to exist, for there is nothing that can be perceived other than it. So this begs the question, if when I turn my awareness within and disengage from the world out there, what is the world out there? Meaning to say, what constitutes the objective world? Now, we've heard that this has to do with anything that can be named, anything that can be perceived by the five senses. But this goes back to Patanjali, who in his Yoga Sutras defines the material world out there, Prakriti, as anything that is in a state of flux, change, that is perishable. And this includes objects, the world of stuff, nature, but it also is anything that we perceive, even our body. Our body, and even more subtly, our thoughts and emotions, are all part of the objective reality. This is a key point to get. I'll say it again. Objective reality here refers to anything that your inner witness sees, and that includes the transient objective reality of thoughts, emotions, and indeed body. So anything we can place in a blank after the word my is perishable. What is not perishable is the I, the witness, the supreme perceiver, meaning to say the experience of subjectivity. So that's what's meant here. And to clarify, I've clarified this before, but we have to be clear that subjectivity doesn't mean my opinion of something. It means it's much simpler than that. It just means the inner witness, which is the only part of you that's been permanent since you were born. Everything else, body, mind, emotions, identity, associations, all of these things are not you because all of them are impermanent. The only thing that has stayed you is your you-ness, your I-ness, your perceptive reality. The fool, of course, by not engaging body, mind, and thoughts, imagines, according to the verse, I have ceased to be. I'm gone, because the fool identifies self, their ultimate self, with the transient world of the body, the transient world of beliefs, and so, of course, therefore suffers. Why? Because anything that's transient, if we hold on to it, will lead to suffering because it must die, dissolve. So the yogi is one who attunes with what does not dissolve, and that is the inner reality of pure perception. This is where Shiva is discovered, and this is what it means to attune with that reality of omniscience, eventually. That is Shiva. Kshemarajah tells us, here, quote unquote, in verse 14, this refers to the Spanda principle, where it comprises both experiences of subjectivity and objectivity, implying that the two states are different or differentiated only by the application of the words that suggest division through the phrase comprised of two states. Let me pause there. In other words, don't be confused by the verse that there's two states that are separate. One is produced by the other. Just as light is produced by the sun, and yet the light can dissolve back into the sun, or that is to say, the light rays can be cut off, and yet the sun still exists, so it is that the world of objectivity is projected from the source light of awareness, and yet the light projection is not permanent while the source light is. So he says, in truth, the two, subjective world, objective world, are really one. And together they consist of Shiva, or Shankara, who is comprised of the mass of autonomous blissful light. This principle pervades forth as the active expression of the subject, who consists of light, and which is undivided from what it illuminates, such as the body, worlds, reality levels, all characteristics, all attributes that are called objects. So when we see objects out there, when we experience the objective world, we know that all of the universe cannot exist without the sun. And this is quite literal, because all of the elements the five elements that consist of all of material reality, from bodies to planets, stardust, all of this comes from the sun. We know this from science. The sun is the source. And in the same way, nothing can live, nothing can be projected, nothing can exist out there unless it is illuminated. And so there's this codependence on the transient objective world, which is considered to be the world of light. And the light is impermanent while the source sun is permanent. So we can have darkness and suddenly everything ceases to be. But at the same time, the source light does not. So what is projected from Shiva is impermanent, but Shiva, the source light, is always present. And he'll unpack this a bit more. And quite fun, actually, the way he does it. Let's bump down to where it says, Kshemarajah, this is how creativity happens. This is a bit lower under the same verses. So he just lays it out. This is how creativity happens. Through the process of sequentially uniting and separating the two realities which govern the objective world. What are these realities? Time and space. In the experience of time, which has to have space, all of time is based on the movement between different objects. In our experience of time and space, we experience the illumination of a multitude of objects, like the body, attributes like the color blue, and so on. So how can we, let's pause there, how can we explain this? Well, this seems to be separate out here, all these different characteristics, objects, the objective reality. So he says, although the very nature of such objects is pure consciousness, they appear as if separate from pure subjective consciousness, Shiva, in the same way that reflections in a mirror seem different from the mirror. We look into a mirror and see a reflection, but the reflection is created in the mirror. It's being projected from it. So the external forms that are manifested that we experience out there are perishable. This perishableness, however, is nothing other than the re-immersion or the withdrawal of the subjective I-ness, the self, and the thatness of objects into their source ground. Therefore, it is only the objective expression of the subject, such as the body, which is cyclically created and destroyed by the Lord, not the subjective experience that is one with the source light of the supreme I. Hence of the two, meaning subject and object, objectivity alone dies, is perishable, while the doer or the subject is imperishable. For it is one with pure consciousness, and experienced as the freedom which is uncaused. The best analogy, I believe, which he's given before, is simply the wave. If we watch waves as objects that rise out of the source ocean, that are projected out of it, they seem real and separate and individual, and yet they dissolve back, as he says here, without using waves particularly. But they re-immerse into the subjective ocean of Shiva. So it is that all of this is constantly being formed, expressed, and dissolved back into the source once again. Why teach this? What's the point of these three verses? The point of these three verses is that we're beginning to plant the seeds in our awareness that in our meditation it's important to be aware of the realities we create, and is my sense of self supremely based or majorly based on the world of stuff. If I describe myself or identify my sense of well-being on objects that are perishable, like a body, like a state of wealth, a state of relationship, titles, possessions, the objective world, then I will surely suffer. This is a guarantee, because we know that all of these things, including the body, are perishable. And this is why people experience depression. It is that simple. Depression comes from being in a rut where we no longer realize, or we've failed to ascertain the reality that the one we're looking for is the one who's looking. And we place our awareness and our hopes and dreams on that which is transient, that which is impermanent. Now, Kshemarajah will not deny the beauty of the objective world. He says blatantly here that objective reality is a pulsation of Shiva. But if you place your awareness and your hopes and dreams in what perishes, in that liminal state of consciousness called the body, let's say, then you've contracted yourself into a zone which will guarantee an outcome of suffering, because you must lose what you would seek to hold. So this is to inspire us. Well, what do we go after? Where is happiness? And the answer is, happiness comes from the very place where it has always come from, the Spanda principle, within inside the self. And we can say, no, I don't know if that's true, because I know that I got happy that day because of that meal that I had, or because of that group of friends I was with, or because of that engagement with that lover, or whatever the memory calls up as a trigger for the high of that day. But of course, the bottom line is that that high of that day was triggered by those experiences, not caused by them. That high is within you. And the high of pure joy, of Spanda identification, always comes at a moment when we, in fact, disengage with the external reality and feel an attunement within. The mind slows, becomes quiescent in moments of pure love, in moments of ecstatic high in playing or hearing music. This is Spanda. So attune with that source instead of looking for it in the world in which we can only find triggers for it. Attune with that source within rather than searching for it in the world of impermanence. Good. Okay, I know that's a heady set of verses, but remember, it takes diving into this text and texts like this over and over to really get the juice, the rasa, the nectar. And some of us are brand new, so we have to go at this with baby steps and assume that we will not fully be able to digest everything, but just take what inspires us and go deeper the next time we go in, or listen to the recordings more than once. Okay. Now identified will be the ever-elusive, legendary fourth state of consciousness. We've already seen and studied the four states, but mainly the top three. And these are roughly equivalent for those into Cog-Sci, etc., brainwave patterns, with the four states identified in that science in the West, which is from the bottom up. The fourth state here would be delta waves, a state of almost pure inactivity, pure suspended awareness. Theta waves are deep sleep in the tantras, perhaps. Alpha waves are dreaming sleep, and beta represents waking consciousness. So there's some correlation there. But we've discussed this already, where in waking consciousness is to experience separation, to experience a world of opposites out there. The dream state, of course, still perceives opposites. We still have adventures when we dream. We still project in our dream a world of opposites, a world of differences. But it's more subtle, because now we have to recognize, well, wait a minute, there's only one dreamer projecting the dream of opposites. So now we move from duality into quasi-non-duality. If you like, the image of a movie projector. So waking consciousness is if I identify the reality with just what's on the screen. I see a movie with opposites, with different objects, with different experiences. But then I can tune my awareness with its source. What is its source? It's the light being projected. Who is the perceiver? This is like the dream state. And then finally, the projector itself, when shut off, if you will, is deep dreamless sleep. Now, when we're in deep dreamless sleep, shashupta, there is no firing off of objectivity. The brain is as if practically dormant, and so there's only pure awareness. Only we're not aware of our connection to Shiva because we're in a stupor, we're unconscious. And of course, here we have the fourth state. Now, the identification is that the fourth state is the Spanda principle. It is that state of awareness in which, when we tap into that deepest bliss consciousness, that springboard of Kundalini Shakti, once we've mastered attunement, identifying with the Spanda principle, that power surges forth in us, and we remain intoxicated in the bliss of non-dual consciousness, even while sleeping deeply, dreaming, or walking down the street. So the text says in verse 17, Tasyo palabdi satatam tripada vyabi chalani nityam syat suprabudasya taradyante prasya tu. There is no transition between the three states of consciousness for one whose awareness is perpetually attuned to the Spanda principle. For the completely awakened person is constantly aware of it, whereas others only perceive it at the beginning or end of each of the three states. Kshamaraja. Quote, the one who is constantly attuned to the Spanda principle, unquote, refers to one whose awareness, due to a firm focus, becomes undistracted from the source light and is even devoid of residual impressions, meaning mental constructs or concepts, associated with concepts such as enlightenment and non-enlightenment. So, pause there. One has attuned so deeply with this source bliss that the whole illusory world of categorization, of compartmentalization, of thinking in opposites dissolves as ridiculous. It's as if their consciousness is a living, pulsating yin-yang, if you will. That symbol comes to mind here. So this one is one whose awarenesses become, through great discipline, rewarded with a full attunement with the Spanda principle. So he continues, her awareness of the Spanda principle is, quote, from the verse, constant throughout the three states, unquote, meaning those states of waking consciousness, jagra, dream, swapna, and dreamless sleep. Saurashupta. The word constantly in the verse refers to the act that she is constantly or remains constantly attuned to the Spanda principle. That is to say, her awareness is unwavering during the beginning, middle, and end of all of these states. For her highest true nature always shines forth as identical with Shankara, Shiva. That is the meaning here. So the enlightened master no longer discerns between the different states of awareness and can actively engage in this flooding bliss in which nothing but pure consciousness is streaming in and out of their heart. If you read Living with Kundalini by the great modern master Gopi Krishna, he describes this viscerally, vividly, in states where he taps into the Kundalini or the Spanda principle. He experiences a surge of this light and realizes that this world of seemingly different objects is all part of that light, as if light waves or waves on the ocean. And so one can engage that as the awakened master, or engage in conversation, engage in mundane tasks, and still have no discontinuity with that surging state, even while dreaming and in dreamless sleep. What about the others identified in the verse? Okay. The others, quote unquote, are partially, or refers to partially awakened people who are drawn to various phases of those three states in which the underlying Spanda principle becomes apparent or unveils itself within their awareness, but only at certain moments, at the beginning or the end of each state. The partially awakened one does not discern the Spanda principle in the middle of each state of awareness. Why? Because they get caught up in a particular objective experience associated with it that has arisen and become established temporarily, which he says will be explained later on. So this partially awakened person is one who gets a glimmer in deep states of practice, gets a surge of that light, gets a glimpse of it at the point of the third eye, feels the Kundalini welling in their body. And so as they shift into deeper brain waves, there's this catalyzation of the Spanda as they move between states, but it doesn't stay. In other words, it comes and goes as their awareness flows in and out of deep meditation. Is the simplest way to explain this. It's a bit technical, but it simply means to say that there's an in-between state between utter unawakened person and a fully awakened person. There's a progress of attunement with Spanda where you get tastes of it. And there's a very dear member of my family, one of my teachers, who had such an incredible taste of this once 30 years ago that he gave up all of his work as in his prior occupation and retired to the mountains to learn to attune and make this living, this experience of inner light that he tasted into a living, constant reality. And he once told me that once you taste that nectar within, nothing else interests you as much. It's the joy behind all joy. It's the source love behind all love. Nothing is as appealing as that. So he then finishes here, Kshemarajya, by very clearly defining this fourth or enlightened state of consciousness. Why is it called the fourth? Well, because we can't describe it with a name. It's beyond concepts. It's a state of absolute non-duality in which one perceives, let us be clear, if the four states are waking consciousness is the ocean wave on the surface, dreaming sleep would be sort of maybe 10, 20 feet below the surface, where my awareness is aware that I project waves called the mind, but I don't have to identify with them. I could simply be in that more quieter state of perceiver. This is the dream state. Then to plunge even deeper into the ocean to where the waves dissolve, we become really introspective and begin to feel that bliss of deep ocean peace, let us say. But that's only the third state, the waveless state. The fourth is when the joy, the rapture that begins to surge in the third state of those that have gone so deeply into the heart, they begin to trigger what's there. And then that energy, that source Shakti, begins to explode and expand all over, and your awareness becomes the entire ocean, including the waves you originally turned away from for this meditation. So this is called life-affirming practice. So he defines the fourth state. Here in the verse, the discussion concerns the transformation of a partially awakened person into a completely awakened one, by way of expanding the peak experience found at the beginning and end phases of these three states, beginning with that of waking consciousness into the middle phase of each of the three. This peak experience consists of the utterly delightful rapture of the fourth state. But no matter where we are in our growth, no matter how often or how little we have a taste of that nectar through a daily effort to attune with it through the yoga practices we'll be hearing about next week, we have verse 18. Jnana jnaya swarupanya shaktya paramaya yutaha padadvaye vibor vati tad anyatra tuchinmaya. The omnipresent Lord appears in two perceptual phases, for he is united to his supreme power, Shakti, out of whom both the knower and the object known arise. Otherwise, he appears as pure consciousness. Kshemarajya clarifies, very brief commentary here. By the omnipresent Lord, the verse refers to Shankara, who, quote, appears in between the two perceptual phases, unquote. This means waking consciousness and dream consciousness. He is united to his, quote, supreme Shakti, unquote, meaning to say the Spanda principle, out of which both the knower and the object known arise. Shankara is generally experienced by the fully awakened being as identical with himself, quote, in the middle state, as the peak reality that is realized between either extreme, the beginning or the end phases of knowledge. Meaning that when we experience the rise of a thought, this is really what the verse is referring to. The unawakened person thinks that this thought is real, solid, and full of some kind of, life important meaning. The partially awakened being realizes, thoughts are just energy. I'm not going to engage in thoughts. But there is this sort of willpower to dissolve or to pull away from getting engaged in thought, because we'll get caught in the cycle of chitta vritti. So this first stage of yoga is always about creating a practice where one turns away from the monkey mind. But here we have the fully awakened being who is so immersed in that deep state that they then can perceive thoughts once again and realize that the middle state of perceiving thoughts as objects, meaning to say a thought or an idea or an emotion is fully manifest right before you, and you can look at it and laugh. Look at it and see it as nothing but a surge of energy, and we no longer fall into the trap of judging and getting entangled in emotions and thoughts. So this is the fully awakened being. But who is it? Who is it that the Lord appears as pure consciousness to, from the verse? Shema says, the Lord appears as pure consciousness. This statement means to one whose awareness is engaged in the fourth state. The word otherwise in the verse does not refer to the state of dreamless sleep, which ordinary people also experience, but they experience it as a state of perpetual stupor. So it only refers to the fourth state. When we've identified and totally awakened that Spanda principle, we experience all other states of awareness as the surge of pure consciousness. Now, Yogananda, in his autobiography, The Yogi, clarifies this without meaning to. He's not referring to this text, by giving us his great experience in chapter 14 of that work, written in the 1940s. And that chapter is called An Experience in Cosmic Consciousness. And he describes how he sees in this state of expanded awareness that objects and thoughts all melt into a luminescent sea of streaming consciousness. So this is the fourth state in which the yogi still sees objectivity but realizes it's all part of a flow of wave energy and is no longer in a state of stupor, no longer in a state of misidentifying thoughts and emotions as traps, as entanglements. In other words, doesn't engage in them as anything other than light, as the light of bliss. Okay, I'm going to pause after verse 21 just a bit, so if you have questions or reflections, please write them in as we move on. Last bit of sort of technicalia, but interesting technicalia, is now the text will turn to the three gunas, or attributes that make up all reality. This is a teaching that goes way back to the Upanishads, way pre-tantric. Some of you know the gunas from studying Ayurveda. The gunas, of course, meaning to say sattva, the essence of subtlety, or sometimes translated as harmony, really the subtle essence of things in our experience of reality. Rajas, which means passion, aspects of reality that are active, dynamic, surging, energetic, passionate. And tamas, which means darkness, but really implies density. So the three gunas, any Ayurvedic teacher or student will tell you, are found as aspects of embodiment, as, of course, the three attributes, even of food, of the types of food that we can take in. All food is categorized under one of these three divisions. So we have Ayurvedic diets prescribed according to your constitution, and that may require a certain accent on one of these gunas. But all of reality has dense matter. Nature, there's density, there's rock, there's thickness, there's the dense elements. Rajas, the passion. This is associated with fire, with water, with elements that are in passion, dynamism. Thoughts are rajasic or tamasic, right? And then there's the essence, the subtle body, the essence behind all of material reality, sattva, which will be unpacked just a bit. The verse says, Guna di spanda, ni syanda, samanya spanda samshaya, labhatma labha, saptatam syor nyasya paripandinaha. The three attributes or gunas and their evolutes flow forth from the source spanda principle and appear to become permanent realities. Because they are manifestations of universal vibration, they never become impediments for one who is realized, for one who is awakened. Now, let's pause there. Who are they impediments for? Well, now we're getting a bit redundant, so the text is driving the point home. if you believe that the world you perceive, which consists of these three qualities, is real, solid, perhaps unchanging, then you are not a realized person. For the realized one is not impeded by an attachment to the objective world, but sees these qualities as part of the surge of change. And we know that all of the physical world comprised of these three gunas is energetic fluctuation. Under the electron microscope, even the most tamasic of all objects, let us say the densest elements in the element table from grade schools, are still nothing more than energetic blips of consciousness, energy that is moving in different variations from other elements. So density is an illusion. That is to say, solidity is an illusion. All of this is streaming forth as pure spanda. So Kshemaraja says, as taught or discerned in the teachings of the recognition school of his great-grand teacher, our old pal, the ecstatic Upaladeva, the Supreme Goddess, who is the sole power of consciousness, contracts herself into the three powers of delusion, Maya, Icha Shakti, or the desire to create in limited zones, such as my worldview, my particular culture, my particular beliefs, my particular geographical orientation. Kriya Shakti, I act within that framework of belief, that framework of the world I've created around me. And finally, Jnana Shakti, which is the limited knowledge of our own perception within these zones. Now, all animals have their own particular contracted perceptual awareness. I think I mentioned this before. Human beings, it is said, at least I've been told, mainly favor the sensory experience of sight. But of course, we have a pretty good flow with the other senses. Other animals, such as a bear, of course, has a much stronger sense of smell than eyesight. A bat, sound. So we begin to ask, well, if different creatures have a proclivity towards a particular sense over the others, which of these creatures is perceiving reality as it is? And the answer is, of course, they all are, because they're all creating their reality as they go along, including us. And this is jnana. That's to say, we create a reality based on what we perceive through what we see, taste, touch, smell, etc. But let's back up. The Supreme Goddess, he says, who is the sole power of consciousness, manifests herself when becoming a body as these three powers. But she who consists of omnipresent power of pure universal consciousness resorts herself to the playground of the physical body, comprised of these three attributes, sattva, rajas, and tamas. But the realized one in the verse, that is to say, the fully awakened being, is defined as one who always attunes to the source spanda principle and can thus never be separated from the bliss of supreme Shakti, whereas the unawakened ones become painfully enmeshed within the embodied playground of Shakti. This is what the verse is teaching. Why is this teaching important? Before Tantra, we had gunas, as I mentioned. We also had the idea that we live in a state of contracted awareness called embodiment. But this teaching is saying that contracted does not mean negative. Contracted means that you are a divine vessel in this divine zone of your own experience that dances in your own creative flow that is unique to you. But those who think that's all that I am is the zone become painfully enmeshed in the embodied play of Shakti. The one who realizes I can play with the delight of my own uniqueness, my own talents, but still attune with the Shakti that is the source of it, can then really play in this body without being caught up in it, attached to it. That is what the verse is teaching. And then finally, how to experience Jivan Mukti. How is it that one can turn into this awakened master, this awakened being through yoga? What is this person like? What is a Jivan Mukta, one who is liberated while alive? Aprabuddha vyastwete swastiti sta ghanodhyataha bhattayanti dhurutare ghare samsara vartmani atasattattam udyuktaha spandatatva vivaktaye jagareva nijam bhavam achitena digachati. But for they whose intuition remains asleep, those vibrating gunas disrupt their experience of being rooted in their own true being. They fall into the terrible path of samsara, rebirth, that is so difficult to walk, to tread upon. Now she who constantly strives to attune with the true essence of pulsation, spanda, quickly realizes her own true being, even while engaged in the world. So the question is, what is this terrible path of samsara? And how can the verse even say that rebirth is terrible? Wait a minute, I thought this is a life-affirming tradition. And to clarify, samsara, I don't think he clarifies this, no. At least I don't think so. Samsara, for the tantrics, is a very, very common term, and it does not mean just the birth and death of a body, like the soul leaving one body and coming into another, the old Buddhist teaching. But rather, it refers to the birth and death of all moments of perception. That is to say, the path of samsara means chitta vritti, or the world of constant transition. So that, I think I mentioned this before, but these points are good to repeat, I think. When we say, I'm going through a lot of, I'm in pain, I'm suffering because I'm going through a lot of change. Well, change is all that there is. So that's sort of a false pretense or statement. So what is a person really saying when they say, this change is really hard for me, I'm suffering? Change of life, perhaps. What we're really saying is, I have forgotten that it's all change, and somehow I got attached to something that is changing, and I'm having trouble coming to peace with it. This is a critical point. So those are people, or I should say when we do that, when we get attached to things and don't accept the dynamism of their consciousness, that they will change, that things will die and be reborn, they fall into the terrible state of samsara, meaning it's as if you get caught in the spin cycle of the surface level of reality. But the one who strives to attune with the source, bindu, of all of this birth and death, quickly realizes the deathless state, even while seeing the world as change. So what is samsara? Kshemaraja tells us, the phrase, quote, for they whose intuition remains asleep, unquote, in the verse, refers to worldly or ordinary people who consider the self to be the body. Underline it, highlight it. The people who are asleep, meaning to say ignorant, are worldly people who consider the self to be the body, not recognizing that the body is inherently comprised of the vibration of the Supreme Goddess Shakti. As previously suggested, the phrase also, meaning people who are in ignorance, also refers to partially awakened yogis who think that the self merely consists of prana. So they're a little bit deeper. The yogis are like, all right, I'm not just this physical blob of, that I see in the mirror that changes, this physical mass of bones, bag of bones here. I'm more refined, you see. I'm a yogi, so I've attuned with Prana Shakti. And Kshemaraja is like, no, not deep enough, because that's in flux too. Go to the source. One who constantly remains ready to attune to that spanda source within is what the verse means by the statement, quote, she who constantly strives to discern the true essence of pulsation, as defined earlier. And then I'm not going to unpack all this here, but I have a footnote on this. He very brilliantly quotes Bhagavad Gita, verse 2 from the 12th chapter, where Krishna teaches Arjuna, the way of the yogi. Krishna says in that verse, they who place their awareness on me as the universal source, constantly engage me, it should say, present, in worship. So Kshemaraj says, the Gita in this quote refers to one who is, quote, constant in his devotion to discovering his own true being, specifically within the jaws of Krishna. This is a great double entendre, because if you study the Gita, you'll recall that in the 11th chapter, Krishna gives Arjuna the vision of the whole cosmos flowing into Krishna's jaws, when Krishna presents himself as time, as death. And here, Kshemaraj is saying, dive into death. Don't kill yourself, but rather accept that all of reality is flowing into the jaws of Krishna, including this body. When you identify with that which will die as inherently myself, I am this body, this mind, and all the post-it notes I've stuck on it, then you will suffer. But the yogi faces death directly, the death of the ego. So he says, what does this have to do with this Krishna teaching, have to do with our Shaiva Tantra teaching? He says, Eva, in the same way, in our present case, one quickly attains their own true being, meaning identity with Shankara. That is to say, he now continuously identifies his own awareness to be that of Shankara, even while in the waking state. As a result of this realization that his own essential self is innately Shankara, he then dives in, plunges into himself, into that heart space. Because of this plunging, he becomes blown wide open. Beautiful. Swayam evam majati yena prabhudo nityodita samavesha se shatdanat suprabhudo jivan mukto bhavititi artaha. He becomes literally blown away. By immersing in the perpetual surge of universal consciousness, he becomes completely awakened, one who is liberated while living, Jivan Mukti. This is what the verse means. Plunge into that nectar that we begin to taste by letting go of identifying with the outer world as who we are and turning within. So let's take a breath in, a couple of breaths in, pausing and releasing all verses we've heard tonight, all that's coming up. Realizing that we've heard whatever we need to hear, the seeds that are meant to be planted are planted. And it's only a trick of the ego, the mind, that says, oh wait, I need to get that. For our awareness will gravitate towards what calls to us. And we can go through this teaching with pure peacefulness. And we'll pause now to see if there's any reflections.
There is one reflection from John in Oakland, and I think this was shared during verse 12 and 13. He shared the reflection of the same as Descartes' second meditation that, quote, even if I am deceived into thinking that I am, therefore surely I am.
That's quite beautiful, and I'd love, John, if you could send that, and perhaps I'll post it, because that was posted this week, wasn't it? I think I remember reading it. No? Okay, maybe it's just in my head. Beautiful, because that is equivalent to the statement that Shiva exists in all states. Shiva is the great I am. And so my consciousness, even if I identify with the limited states of transient thought, identify with that as self, it's still, that level of awareness is Shiva, only a distorted version because, of course, thoughts are the choppy waves on the surface. But still, that tells me that if there is a wave, the wave is moving something. Thoughts are waves of waveless consciousness. Thoughts are waves of an ultimately waveless consciousness that is called, in this tradition, the massive bliss of Shiva. So, by merely an intention to attune with Spanda, we begin to let go and turn within to the source. What is the source of my thoughts? What is the source of witnessing my thoughts? What is the source? What is? And then the what disappears. And there's just is. So with great joy now, and some goosebumps here, and in fact, great thrill, because the timing of it being Halloween is impeccable, I want to present with our remaining time the absolutely divine verse, or Karika rather, stanza 22. Now, I'm happy to report to you that, actually, I feel a little silly to report that in all these years of being absolutely in love with this 22nd Karika, I never once ventured to read Kshemaraj's commentary on it, even though I've had his commentary for years. And the other day, I went into it, and I tell you, I could scarcely get through it without being so moved that I had to pause every few breaths. For what we'll find here is what could arguably be his greatest moment of poetic inspiration and of yogic empowerment in this teaching. For verse 22, we can call it a verse, it's okay, stanza verse, gives this extremely tantric teaching, which suddenly, I shouldn't even say that, I should go deeper, non-dual Shakta or goddess-based tantric teaching, which accepts that the yoga of daily practice that we'll look at next week is mainstream in Tantra, of turning emotions, the energy of thoughts and emotions, into the resonance of pure mantra. But here we have a radical teaching, which is to say that, or the question is asked, does Spanda, the source goddess, ever appear in waking states? And if so, how can I catalyze those moments to ride intense emotional states into the bliss of the enlightened moment? And so the text gives radically extreme experiences that human beings from time immemorial have experienced, and claims that the enlightened state is suddenly manifest there. So the yogi is one who, as we've seen, is always ready for Spanda. That is to say, they're looking in any intense emotional or life experience for the trigger point that may lead them into that source Spanda, which will typically be an intense emotion or sensual experience, whether it's pleasant or not, in which mental churning or activity suddenly is obliterated, and there's nothing but pure Shakti happening in the body. So the verse is as follows: Ati kruda prahishto va kim karomiti va mrishan dhavan va yat padam gachi tatra spanda pratishtita. The essence of Spanda becomes clearly evident or manifest, apparent, in one's perceptual awareness when entering particular emotional states, such as extreme anger, overwhelming joy, fear associated with running for your life, running away, or when anxiously wondering, what am I going to do? Accent on the panic in my voice. That's the implication here. In these moments, Spanda appears, and the yogi, without identifying a judgment on the experience, immediately recognizes the opportunity. And this is why this high Shaiva Tantra of the Shakta, the goddess tradition of the Spanda school, becomes so absolutely life-affirming, because suddenly those activities which we are afraid of, such as intense fear, or maybe getting caught up in the passion of sensual joy, will take us off our spiritual path. No, this tradition says, do your yoga, take time off from the mind and life activity, but when you are out there in the world, be ready for Spanda, because your awakening may come in that moment. And we can refer to a million case examples, which we don't have time to hear. You can read the work of the great Irish mystic, for instance, Jacob Boehme, who lived in the 12th or 13th century, totally unaware of these teachings, a good old Irish Catholic man in a very, very rudimentary age where that was the only religion allowed in Ireland. And he was a cobbler nailing his shoes one day in his basement shop, and he looked out the window, and his eye level was at the level of the geraniums, and it had just finished raining, and the sun came out, and his eye became fascinated with a single drop that was rolling off a petal of a geranium. And it slowly came to a standstill, and his breath stopped, and he waited for it to fall, and it slowed more and more. Then the light beam refracted in the drop, hit his eye, and from what we can tell in his writings, caused an instant awakening. He talks about the surge of this vibrating power of God through his body, which we might call Kundalini. This is fortunate for him, but we know that these experiences can come in these intense states of presence, of emotional intensity. So what I'm going to give you now is, I hope, will serve as a final meditation. I'm not going to unpack it. Rather, I invite you to close your eyes and to receive the visual, because he will give us 3 visuals of what's actually happening when we experience these emotions. How these are goddesses that if we attune the source power of, can lead to an instant moment of awakening. And it's beautiful poetry. The goddess of intense anger, the goddess of intense longing, the goddess of flight instinct, escape, and the Spanda experience that can be achieved just before death. So we'll find here a little bit of Halloween energy because there's a little bit of murder in our death example, and I didn't plan that. It just worked itself out nicely. Okay. So let's take a breath in. Let's do one Shleen, because we're really honoring the goddess here, the goddess in her various manifestations. Inhaling slowly into the heart, opening our jaw, vibrating out. Tatva hi samantara vihita dharano bhagata shatru darshanan marma sparshita tat vachana karanadva pratatam evon nishat som jiharsha devata balad antarmukhi bhavad rashni chakroti krudaha. For example, these are all from Kshemarajah now. None of this is me. Okay, here we go. So, for example, just after witnessing a violent attack by a villainous person, for example, or after hearing the pitiful words of that victim before he is mortally struck by a weapon, the intense rage at the Kruda that one might experience is actually a circle or a retinue, meaning to say a host of goddess powers who appear within oneself, driven forth by the force of the goddess of destruction, Somji Hirsha, who appears instantly when the peak of one's anger is felt. In moments of intense joy, Tatahi samanantara vihita dhaluno bhagata chira prartita praneshiva dhanendu darshanad eva tat kshaman evom majad purna bilashat evata vasha dikasitanu dhavat samasta karana chakra prahrishto va balavad Asta Tayi Balena Sarvato Valitatwat Kandi Shika. When a man who sees his beloved for the first time after a lengthy absence, during which he intensely longed for her, she appears to him as radiantly beautiful as the light of the moon. The ecstatic joy he feels is the intensity of the goddess whose name is intense longing, Kandishika, who in that moment intensely and precipitously surges forth into his awareness, accompanied by her goddess clan of the stimulated senses, who run towards that lover of his just as his longing bursts forth and completely fills him with nothing but the experience of sheer desire alone. This is the sudden flowering forth of the essence of Spanda. The Spanda experience just before death. Kim karomiti mershan vikatayan samshaya dhara dhiro hatmani padenu pravishtaha kshina sakala lambana vikasad samshaya somvit niralamba nikrita vritti prasaro. A person who has entered a state of overwhelming mental anxiety while wondering what to do, quote unquote. That is to say, a person who is mentally obsessing with the thought, what am I going to do? This has triggered the moment that someone is confronted with the impending destruction of his body, when his anxious awareness loses its foundation and he realizes there's no way to escape, and that moment leaves him in that expansive serenity of pure Spanda. He knows he's going to die. The mind dissolves away and the Spanda is revealed. Finally, who is the goddess of escape, flight, self-protection? Vamata bharana dhyanu bhadyamano daban sharira nirpeksham eva swatma pravani kritretara vritti prasarad udyogad evi preranayati twaritab palayana kriya vishtova. Running away in the verse connotes, for example, one who's being attacked by an enraged running elephant, who runs away with total non-attention towards his own body. He becomes totally possessed by the active presence of she who is the goddess of, let me get the hell out of here, the goddess of escape, literally, who is the embodiment of the flight instinct that arises as one's only reality and immediately obliterates all mental activity, which is withdrawn into himself. In this and similar situations, such as the attack of a lion, yogis who are continually ready to engage that Spanda principle are prepared for any situation in which mental activity is suddenly caused to dissolve. For in that moment, Spanda pratishtita spanda tatvam abhimuki bhutam eva tishtati vritti kshayatmake padeva sta visheshe. For in that moment, one becomes transfixed in the source Spanda, for that is all that is left facing him or her. So I left it as a cliffhanger on purpose. He'll bring this teaching, this reflection to conclusion. How do we prepare for these moments which will come to some of us? Hopefully the pleasure one more than the others, but we're ready for any of them. And so until we unpack that next week, and we'll only do that for about 10 minutes of the next class because we'll immediately move into the actual practice, meaning to say that once we are aware that, wait a minute, these experiences lead to these goddess powers of my senses flooding forth and dissolving the mind, how can I then attune with Spanda in those moments of rapture, of intense fear, of impending death, but more importantly, just in everyday life. And this will be given to us as the practice of honoring those goddesses with the mantras that embody them, inhaling those mantras and resonating, literally coiling and releasing through the body that Spanda Shakti that reveals itself in the moment where the mind dissolves. So some reflections for this week, and I ask you, everybody, to share, if it's not too personal, at least an answer to at least one of these. And the reflections are, how can these examples, which are extreme, of course, on purpose, serve my and my approach to everyday life? How might my own intense goddesses, such as these, because we all have these goddesses named here, become my liberators? Third, what does it mean to me to be a yogi in this way, who is continually ready to engage the Spanda principle in any situation, such as the experience of intense desire, experiences associated with loss that perhaps we'd rather not consider? Finally, how might this change my overall outlook and approach to life? In what ways can this practice, empower my life? So we ask you to contemplate these in your own journal, in your own way, and to share on the Facebook page, and I'll repost in there, one of your reflections, one of your answers, or a rumination. So with that, I'll turn it to Meredith and see if there's any last questions or shares.
There's one final reflection by David, who shares that verse 22 reminds him of a similar idea presented by Gurdjieff, that we can have a peak experience of self-awareness in the face of extreme trauma. Although we might have mild traumas in daily life, the type of events mentioned in verse 22 are fortunately fairly rare in most of our lives. Does the Spanda Karika have practices that do not depend upon sporadic traumatic events? Is this example of trauma mentioned first because, like drugs, trauma might be more noticeable for those not yet engaged in sadhana?
That is an absolutely brilliant question, and I'm so glad David asked this. I hope everybody heard that, and I'll recapitulate. The question essentially is, why are these extreme examples given? Do we need really intense experiences to happen to attune with Spanda? And of course the answer is no. However, the text brings these up, and Kshemarajah gives examples like reuniting with a long-lost love, states of fear, etc., because most human beings have experienced one of these and will recall with some reflection that, wait a minute, yeah, that's actually true. My mind was blown in that moment, and there was nothing but pure awareness. And I remember a particular high. It's very arguable that, and it's stated, in some spiritual texts, there's a tremendous high with that moment of surrender before death, for example, or giving in to the fact that I'm in pure flight mode right now. So we can go back into our peak experiences of pure intensity, note how we felt that Spanda essence, felt even the bliss in the horrible ones that's underneath this, the bliss of surrendering to this power of acceptance. And once we've tasted that nectar, then we develop the daily sadhana to tap into it without needing these intense things to happen to see it. And that is where we will take off next week. What is the daily practice? So with that, Om Shanti 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 Namostute. I bow to everyone who takes the time and effort to indulge in this beautiful teaching, which can only open our hearts in just the way it's meant to. Thank you for being with us. We look forward to seeing you in cyberspace this week, and happy Halloween. Don't get surrounded by a gang of murderers, though, even though that's a sadhana here, I say jokingly. Okay. Good night. Thank you.